Hello and welcome to another Tuesday Talk with Ruby Reese. My name is Quinlan, I'm co-founder at Ruby Reese and I will also be your host. Today we are going to be talking all about gun dogs, and it's a fantastic time to think about, looking back into your dog's past to understand their present. We've done previous episodes that are all about the predatory sequence, and so they're also very, very interesting. We at Ruby Reese, as always, have been really looking into nutrition, and that's also an area that it's really, really exciting to look into the past, both the recent past of dogs since they split from wolves, but also the long history as wolves, and then before that as various canid predecessors. So all of these generations, hundreds and thousands of generations and years of generations have somewhat of an impact, certainly on our dogs of today. And I suppose it's always important to point out in an episode like this that we're never really saying that our dogs are wolves, as in they're not we're not comparing them and saying that they're exactly the same as the grey wolf that we see in parts of the world today. But there are some remnants of being a predatory canid for sure, still somewhere locked into their DNA. So in a sense, we have as humans, we've bred dogs specifically into their different breeds over hundreds and thousands of years, to fulfill purposes. And really it's only in the last couple of decades, I suppose, that they've truly become house pets, a lot of these. And as we're about to hear today as well, it could even be very, very recently that the strain of dog moved from being a working dog with a very specifically inbred purpose and a job to do, to being pets. So really, really interesting time. You're about to listen in to the brilliant conversation that I had. While I'm introducing it, you might just give us a little follow, a like, a 5-star rating, whatever you can do on the platform that you're listening to this podcast. We would really, really appreciate your help if you did so. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Claire from Snout and About, who joined me for this fantastic chat. So I hope you enjoy listening into the conversation that we had. Claire, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast this week. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. Thank you very much for having me, Quinlan.
Thank you. And would you do us the pleasure of introducing yourself briefly?
I will indeed. So my name is Claire Quinlan. I am, my trading name, I guess, is Snout and About Kerry. So about 2 years ago now, I joined up with the fabulous Catherine in Snout and About Cork. So I'm kind of the Kerry contingent. So I've been a dog trainer for about 13 years. Qualified in Queen's College a long time ago. I've been fostering for about 20 years. Fostered about 140 dogs, I'd say, and then finally, I suppose, through that whole process, ended up certifying as a behaviour consultant in 2022. So that's my journey here so far. I was a human physio back in the day as well, so I've finally switched over completely to dogs. So
that is amazing. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. And you picked a brilliant topic as well for this week. So we decided to talk about gun dogs, a really specific grouping of dogs. So what exactly are gun dogs?
So I guess gun dogs are the more modern version of hunting dogs, because we have to remember as well that technically the gun hasn't always been around for hunting. There was lots of other different forms of hunting that developed long before the gun. So I guess the origins of gun dogs goes way back, long before we even really had a gun or something that could actually take down a prey animal from a long distance. So when we look at humans and dogs, I guess initially the dog's primary role was probably for alerting and a little bit of protection, but I think always for a level of hunting as well, because obviously we primarily use our vision, whereas dogs primarily use their nose. So again, they had this amazing talent that we could never have of locating something that we couldn't see. And actually being able to track that down in a way that we can't. No matter how good a tracker you are, your visual element of your prey animal isn't traveling to you via the wind. So dogs, I guess, have always accompanied us on different hunting missions. Your initial hunting dogs, I guess, would have mainly kind of scented prey, really tracked them down, and sometimes kind of held prey, we'll say. So chasing and holding prey would have been kind of a primary role. But then I guess when humans started to develop different ways of hunting, before we had the gun, what we actually needed was a dog that was able to freeze. Because if you can imagine, before we had the gun, we had to be almost on top of the prey in order to kill them and to bring them home with us. So we needed a dog, for example, when we had a crossbow or when we had clubs, different things that we would have used for hunting in the past, to actually be able to find the prey and freeze and point them. So that's really, it's likely that the first type of hunting dogs that really were brought along in all of these missions were along the lines of setters and pointers. That kind of group of dogs, that type of breed that was very likely to freeze. And again, freezing is something that we always do. Like if you have a fly swat in your hand and you're about to swat the fly, there's always this little freeze that you do first. So it's a natural behavior in dogs, but it would definitely appear more in certain groups of dogs. So those are most likely the ones that developed first. Now, when it changed quite a bit when guns really started to become more commonplace, because again, the first gun, if you think about it, had to be used on something that was stationary, because it was so big that often a couple of people actually had to hold it. It wasn't something that you could move around, it wasn't something you could maneuver easily, and you also had to be able to shoot bird or prey on the ground while they were in a static position. So that's when your pointers came in. Now again, then kind of that would have been around the 13 and 1400s pretty much, and we see a lot of evidence of dogs being used in that way. The dogs, again, quite close and really pointing and pointing to different prey. But then, as I suppose guns became lighter and more available to not just nobility, but also to, I suppose peasants and tenants and kind of everybody really, we started to see dogs starting to have to work a lot further off. So a lot of the primary hunts, I guess, would have, well, there's lots of different ways of doing it, but one particular hunt would have been where you would have a larger, bigger, stronger dog running further away, tracking harder to catch and harder to find prey. So they'd need to be really, really athletic, built for the challenge, built for different terrains, and very often they'd actually drive the prey back towards you, and drive them back towards the guns. So that'd be kind of more of what they'd call a drive hunt. So that's a very specific task, and they probably would have been the first group. So your bigger dogs. There's, I guess, when we think about it, there's really 4 different types of gun dogs. So you have your pointing dog, your flushing dog, and your retrieving dog. They're really the 3 that we use now.
And the flushing dog is this big dog for kind of driving the prey back to you, is that right?
Yeah, that would have been one of them. That also so that would have been one version, would have been the flushing. But also what we started to see developing more when we got a bit more specialized in our hunting and started to hunt different species, were things like your spaniels. So they'd be your real typical flushing dog now. And you can see that in their movement. They're literally designed to dig into hedges, to go in and flush the birds, to send them up into the air, or to flush out animals that would be static in a den situation. A pointer would generally point at them, which might be no good because they might be inside in a bush, and you need them to be out in the open. So that's when we started to really see these spaniels, these little balls of energy that just want to root around and drive things out. But obviously they're no good when you're working with bigger prey, because if they were trying to flush those, the bigger prey is just going to run off way out of sight and way out of your reach, basically. So then we started to see groups specializing a little bit more as we started to have different different tools. So again, we go back to the crossbow. We needed dogs that were going to work a lot closer to us. They didn't need to be as athletic. They tended to be your bigger dogs, but we needed the weapon that we had wasn't able to travel that far, so they needed to work closer. As we developed the gun, we started to see these big, wide, long-ranging dogs, such as one of the dogs that I live with, that tend to work a lot further away from you, and they work hugely independently, because obviously they're not looking back to us asking what do we do next. They really are being sent out at the appropriate time, doing their job independently, and it's very much an innate behavior that they will do anyway. There's a lot of writing to say that that really, with a gun dog, you don't have to train a lot of these things if you've the right dog for the right job, because it's just an innate behavior that they'll do.
Yeah, second nature to them, literally. And before, while we're still in the past, really quite far in the past, really, I suppose 700 years ago, kind of in the 1400s, a lot of the breed names that you mentioned are names that we'd recognise today as relatively household names that everyone would definitely know. So were these breeds already like pretty fully formed and very much similar to the dogs we have today back then? Have they stayed the same since then, do you think?
It was probably more when the lighter guns that we were able to carry kind of one person, and they were actually able to move freely with them, that we started to see the diversification into more retrieving, flushing gun dogs as such. Back in the kind of 1400s was the first time that we started to see people, what we call shooting over dogs, but it was probably more around that Victorian era when we really started to see the diversification, or a little bit before that we started to see dogs being split off into these different kind of retrievers. So they really had that desire to pick something up, to go after something, pick it up and bring it back. And again, with the retrievers, it was quite interesting. A lot of them are your water dogs, because obviously back at that time, swimming wasn't something that people did in a lot of cases, and it was something that people were quite fearful of, the water itself. So the best thing to do was to send in a dog. So that's really where a lot of these water dogs and water retrievers came from. But also, what was quite important, obviously, when the weapons weren't quite as developed as they are today, you didn't have this lovely eye and this magnifying part of the gun. There was obviously a lot of animals that were wounded, but not actually killed. They weren't just falling in the spots. We also needed dogs to actually go and to be able to track them and hold them so that they could be killed and taken back as prey. So that's where these names really started to split off, when we started to see the more mobile guns and kind of traveling across countryside a little bit more, and we see dogs having different uses then, when the hunts were a little bit more organized in different ways to get a higher number of prey with multiple people and multiple weapons.
And so can gun dogs actually be trained for then other roles and sports outside of hunting, or are they really innately hunting dogs?
Well, I guess that's when you, with that question, I guess what you're talking about there, or where what's relevant there, is whether they really are a strong working line, or whether they're a show line, because they're the other things we have to think about. With the really strong working lines, I live with one. I live with a German wirehead pointer that was literally bred, and probably for many lines before him, of a really strong working dog. Now, he was gun shy, so he ended up in a pet home, but he is an absolute and utter hunter. From the second that we go outside the door, that's all he's doing. He doesn't actually want to do anything else. That great podcast you had about the predatory sequence, that first little bit, your orient, or what I would call the hunt, where the nose is in the air and they're immediately locating prey. For us, it's cats in the estate. That's Gus's big thing that he's immediately hunting. But that's the mode that he goes straight into. The second that we're outside of a building, that is all that he does from start of the walk to finish. It does not change. So we've had to find little creative ways to make that, to get his needs met, but also to realize who he is and to be able to actually to live with him in this environment, I guess. But so can they be trained to do other things? Absolutely, of course. It depends, I guess, what age that you get them, whether they're a working line or a show line who mightn't have such strong drives to engage in these behaviours. For Gus, the slow type of training, so we'll say any kind of maybe obedience where he's in a long down state, that's just not going to work for him. Things like agility, where what I find that works really, really nicely for him is following kind of some verbal cues, especially using the sound in my voice, using a really long, slow woo for slowing down, or kind of using my voice in a kind of a quicker way, like go, go, go for speeding up. So he loves that. But again, it's very similar, I guess, to some of the cues that would be used in that hunting type situation. So they definitely can, of course they can. And you see a lot of the pointers in canicross, you see a lot of them in those really kind of energetic sports, because these big hunting dogs like the wire-haired pointers are designed to run just incredible distances over all kinds of terrain. So the old static kind of slower dog sports don't quite do it for them, but yes, they can absolutely be trained. But again, it depends, I suppose, on your skill. You do need to, their motivations are slightly different. You could have 10 stakes hanging around your mouth or hanging around your neck, and it's just not going to be anywhere near as valuable as being able to engage in the pursuit of something or anything, or tracking something.
And I suppose it's always the way with dogs, really, isn't it? You have to take a kind of an individualized approach anyway, regardless of what breed they are, or what color they are, or what height they are. It can be kind of irrelevant if the individual is not really wired exactly the same as they, their category might be.
Hugely.
So like you say, yeah, exactly. So it's more probably about finding the specific drives for your own individual dog, and then using that. But things like the predatory sequence can definitely help you identify, I suppose, different activities that might then be related. Yeah,
hugely. And with Gus, like for example, so it's quite interesting actually, and it's something that I think is quite important for people to know as well, is with in England and in other areas of the continent, when gun dogs were developing, they developed much more into single job. So we'd say we'd have your flush, we'd have your point, and we'd have your retrieve. But in Germany, actually, Germany and certain other countries, but mainly Germany, they have a very strong wish for a versatile dog. So a dog that actually does all three. So instead of having multiple dogs for multiple jobs, they tend to err towards your versatile dogs. So what we see then is actually a level of all of those little elements in them used for kind of one thing. So they can be, for example, a spaniel is really just going to want to flush and drive in under things, but wouldn't necessarily run further away. But actually the German breeds, especially German wirehaired pointers, your Weimaraners, all of those guys that have been really, really specifically developed to do everything. So again, you can see they're not quite, just as you were saying, to look at your individual dog, they're not quite, one thing isn't the primary motivator. It can be a little bit of many things. So but just to know that about the German breeds, if you have a German short-haired, long-haired, wire-haired pointer, or your Weimaraners, they definitely are more versatile. But again, the primary driver and primary motivation is that seeking kind of drive, that there's always a want to hunt and to actually to follow and chase down, or whatever it is, prey. So it's a very interesting one, but one you can definitely work with and adapt to.
yeah, definitely. And we touched on the working and the show or the pet lines. Maybe for people that don't understand what show lines are all about, when did we start showing dogs? And I suppose this is probably a very recent concept, is it?
Relatively recent, yeah, absolutely. Most likely in around, again, that kind of Victorian era. So kind of when we started to see this huge split in breeds, and we started to really kind of tinker around with developing new breeds and new sizes and all different aesthetics, and seeing what we could do. It's most likely that it started to come in around then, because it really was one of the first times that we started to breed for the look of a dog and the conformation, the formation, the anatomy of a dog, not related to function. So that's really what we started to see in the show lines. There was a breed characteristics really were developed, and then it was the selection and the selective breeding to fit into that. But also, if you can imagine, when you're showing a dog, you're not looking for that dog to immediately go into hunt mode the second it comes into the ring. It has to be quite static, very, very easily handleable, and be motivated by slightly different things. So most likely what happened there was that the individuals, the same way as you can breed together a load of border collies that are totally into herding, and you'll still have a couple. You'll have a couple of those puppies that really just want to sit on the couch and watch a bit of Netflix, or they want to hunt and flush prey, but they're not going to quite fit into things. But again, maybe coming out with that slightly calmer demeanor, and then selectively breeding those members of groups together, we started to develop a show line, and looking for those little aesthetic bits as well. So then really there was a kind of a diversification between the working lines and the show lines. The working lines still very much chosen for working jobs, whereas your show lines much more for people with the interest in traveling with their dogs and showing their dogs, and in, I guess, maintaining and grooming their dogs.
And it's actually interesting now that you're saying all of these things. Not many people know it about me, but I grew up with St. Bernards, and we were showing the St. Bernards. So not gun dogs, I don't think. More like a kind of rescue idea in their heritage. But nonetheless, we were going to all the Irish Kennel Club shows, and and we ended up Bella, our first St. Bernard. She was an All Ireland champion and everything. So I kind of grew up in this world, and it every now and then I get kind of flashbacks. And as you were speaking, I kind of got a bit of a flashback there to, we often heard how good Bella was, that she was great at standing kind of in this beautiful preened kind of stance in the ring, looking very regal. Absolutely. And, everyone used to come up to us saying, "Oh, are you going to breed Bella? She's a perfect show dog." And now that you're explaining the show lines and why people, selectively bred them, it just kind of brought me back to a total different place there. So it's really, really interesting to hear that some dogs are perfect for that working line, and then others are just much more made for the show ring and for being
and there's
pets.
such completely different characteristics that we're looking for in those two, because one definitely doesn't work in the other, even though they're the same breed. And there was a very interesting study done actually, that I must send you to pop in the show notes, but it showed that actually trait-wise that there was more similarities between your working line collie and your working line Labrador than there was between your working line collie and your show line collie. So actually, even between two different breeds, you were seeing much more just similarities really between the working lines of two different breeds.
Wow, that is incredible actually, yeah. And then talking about these specific type of dogs as pets, then I suppose is interesting as well, because particularly if you've got working line dogs coming into family homes, how do we deal with this? Do we see problems coming up, and how do we deal with the mental stimulation that might be needed?
Absolutely. And I think, again, show lines would have been your typical pets really, because obviously those characteristics work a lot better in a pet home. And for a long time really we were seeing the majority of pets were really coming from your show lines. But I definitely noticed during COVID, now there was always, of course, there was working line dogs ending up as in pet homes. But more often it would be a dog that maybe was brought out hunting during hunting season and then kind of became a bit of a pet for the rest of it. But your full working dog coming into a pet home, we weren't seeing a huge amount of that, but I did really notice it starting to creep in a lot more in COVID. And I think what happened there, if you think about the amount of work that goes into selecting a dog that's really going to be super easy to train for actually these really challenging tasks, because you're asking a dog to go so far into the predatory sequence but not complete it, because you don't want a half-eaten duck coming back to you after your hunt. It's quite a strong set of skills, and obviously there is training involved as well, but you really want to see this a natural emergence of these traits in dogs. So there's a lot of work that goes into selecting them and breeding them in these really high level breeders. So they were quite expensive, and they were much more expensive than we were used to seeing in the pet industry as such. But I think during COVID, because everything changed, because a lot of these working dogs actually weren't there weren't hunts going on. There weren't people actively looking for working dogs because we were quite restricted. The shows in some ways had kind of stopped as well. There was lots of things changed, and for the first time ever we started to see the prices of pet dogs really starting to come on par with the prices of working line dogs. And I think a lot more breeders of working line dogs started to maybe look into the pet industry a little bit more. So definitely following COVID, I personally and many of the trainers and consultants that I've spoken to about this have seen a huge increase in the amount, especially of crossbreeds, but also of pedigree working line dogs ending up in pet homes. And it can definitely be an absolute and utter whirlwind for people. It is literally just two different sets of needs that are so different from each other, just locking horns and butting heads for quite a bit, especially around adolescence. Because some of them are such beautiful dogs, and obviously the retriever has always been very much kind of put out there as your classic family dog. But again, we wouldn't have been seeing your working line Labradors and your working line retrievers before coming into pet homes. But yes, it is challenging. It is definitely challenging. I think the most important thing with a lot of the gun dogs when they're coming into your home, but also the working line gun dogs, is developing that relationship, because I guess that's the strongest thing that's always there with, you know, your typical man and his dog, because the dogs were really running off a lot of their own instincts when they're out, and a lot of this is obviously off lead. They're released to do their job. So I think the relationship between the owner and a gun dog is definitely the place that you want to put the most of your work when we try and go in with your classical obedience training, especially around adolescence and social maturity, when you're really starting to see some of these innate behaviours starting to leak out. We can really feel like we're butting our heads against a brick wall, because their set of needs and what they need to get from an exercise is just so different to what you need. So we do definitely see that. We see, you know, your pointers and your springers, their recall being really poor, because the set of motivators that present when they're outside are just incomparable to the amount of treats in your pocket. You know, it's just, so people get really frustrated. They've done all their fabulous recall work at home, and then they've maybe done it in the green area in front of their house, but then all of a sudden you go to a woods and your dog is gone for 20 minutes. And in that 20 minutes, you've decided that they're going back to the breeder. You took on something you didn't want, and it's just, yeah, it can be really frustrating and really hard for owners with all the work that they've put in. They just see it fall to pieces when they reach an area that just excites all those little innate drives and behaviours that your gun dog wants to carry out, and has been really specifically and selectively bred to carry out. So it's a challenge, and it's definitely something that we get called into quite a lot, because when needs aren't being met, and obviously the need level of a working line gun dog is going to be the needs that they have are really not conducive to a pet home. So we are going to see some of these behaviours leaking out. You can see a lot of destructive behaviour is something that, like, unimaginable destructive behaviour sometimes with your working line gun dogs. Okay. You know, thousands of euro worth of damage, or you know, it can be quite high level when their needs aren't being met. But the beautiful thing, I guess, from our perspective, is sometimes when we go in, we just tweak things. We don't necessarily always give somebody more work to do, but we try and increase their understanding of the dog that they have, and start to focus on slightly different things, and you can really develop then a beautiful relationship, and needs being met on both sides.
And I suppose, like, when people really do need to consider the fact that, yes, they might have put in weeks or months worth of work with the treat pouch, like you say, but there's been so many professionals that have put in hundreds of years worth of genetic work to make these dogs independently capable of doing that specific job that they were bred for. So, you know, you're competing with centuries, you know. It's
100%. Just especially with that working line, it can be a challenge. But funnily enough, when you meet their needs, because they've always been selected to not you're not hunting 24/7. There's very much an on period and an off period as well. So they can be some of the best dogs to live with if their needs can be met. And you do end up looking like a little bit of a nutter. So myself and Gus spend quite a bit of time running around hedges, basically checking them out. And we have different cues now where he'll point, but we'll say this is on lead. He'll look and he'll point. He's not charging in after anything anymore, but he's getting his needs met at that point. He's getting the seeking. So I'm running around at the end of the other lead, or the other end of the lead, like a loon, and we're looking into hedges and lots of those kind of Simone Muller, some of the Simone Muller stuff, the predatory substitute training, but also just getting him as close as is appropriate in a human-centric world to carry out the behaviours he's been designed to do. But actually not carrying it through, obviously, to the end. But there's lots and lots of ways that you can do that. Also, for the working line dogs, definitely developing a level of off-lead time, I think, is vital. In some way, whatever that means, whether that means a fenced garden, whether that means a private hire dog park, whether you're lucky enough, like I am, to live in areas where you can always be pretty much on your own on a beach or in a sand dune or in a forested area. Because the beautiful thing about these dogs, and you hear a lot of people who've been working with gun dogs for a long time, is once they kind of get their jobs done, the only place they want to come is back to you. And it's very much, that's also one of those innate characteristics in a dog, and especially you see it a lot in springers. People would love their little springer to walk next to them on a lead, but there's absolutely nothing in a springer's body that wants to walk in a straight line at your speed. It's just one of those things that when I start to work with the client, we see where we can meet in the middle. And very often that's on a long line, but obviously with a springer, again, they're going to wrap themselves 100 times around a tree. But amazingly, sometimes if you do a little bit of groundwork and you start to really understand the motivations of your dog, they can actually start to have some off-lead time, because very often they're going to work quite close to you. You just won't be able to see them every second. But once you find a safe area, and usually there's something, and it doesn't have to be every day, it can even be once or twice a week, that you're able to go to this safe area and give them a little bit of time where they're going to want to work quite close to you, but work in their own way that does not suit a lead at your side at all, and even whether it's a horse arena or whatever it is, there's always somewhere that we can find, and we've gotten really, really crafty with this. Or it might be an area, if a dog does need to be on lead from safety issues, or just the environment just isn't conducive to starting to build in work or off lead time. Even finding a field and just walking around the edges, so they can't get wrapped around trees, but they're given enough access into different hedges that they are able to carry out those behaviours that really just allow them to feel satiated and fill up their little soul cups. Then you can do a little bit of loose lead walking practice afterwards, but really only when the dog has had their needs met. There's just walking a working line springer, getting them to walk on a loose lead without having their needs met it can be a really, really challenging one. And it's definitely, people have a huge amount more success when they understand who they have and how to mold that, and the times when your dog they actually can then start to engage with you, because they've filled up their own soul cup and they're ready to do a little bit of engagement work with you.
That's it. And I mean, I suppose it's really the pure and utter meaning of enrichment as well, right? When you're fulfilling these deep inner desires of the dog and what they were kind of bred to do. I suppose what a lot of listeners will definitely resonate with is the Labrador emerging from a big muddy puddle, with or without their owner, depending on how tight they were holding onto the lead.
Absolutely.
and it's probably the happiest Labrador in the world right then.
100%. You're just hoping that there's a clean puddle or a clean stream that you can send them into next before you have to go back to the car.
That's it. And we spoke earlier about looking at dogs individually, but maybe to stereotype a little bit, I suppose it's worthwhile looking at the groupings as well, and the breeds that are in them. So for people listening in, we mentioned a lot of the water retrievers already, so that's what really fits in under those as examples. your, I suppose, your Labradors, your Newfoundlands, maybe your
Yeah, very
Golden
much.
Retrievers,
Now your Newfoundland would
Poodles.
be more a little bit more of your guardian breed
Uh-huh.
as such. It would be a slightly different role, but absolutely they were also
Yeah.
retrieving from waters, but they wouldn't be technically your gun dog group as such. Would be a little bit more pushed over into
Yeah.
the guardian. They'd have different traits, I suppose, that were built into them a little bit more. Oh, there's so many different dogs. You see a lot of the double coated, so you'll see dogs that have that little kind of the double coat, almost your waterproof layer on top. And you
Hmm.
see a lot of kind of your wire hairs as well, or your kind of curly hairs, your poodle, exactly. So
Hmm.
there's lots and lots of just a huge variety. You're really talking about hundreds, almost hundreds of breeds covering the whole gun dog side of things. And again, you're seeing in the versatile breeds, they'll be working both on land and in water. The versatiles that come a little bit more from kind of the continent. But your typical absolutely would be your lab and your retriever, allowing us to
And
be on land while the dog is retrieving. They're all different types of, like your duck-toiling retriever. There's all of these. There's
mhm.
huge amounts of them, but they're so interesting, and they've all just been developed for a need basically. So again, you're working on a certain type of terrain. You need a certain type of dog. So if you want a dog to be tunneling more into whether it's undergrowth or into hedges, you need shorter legs. You need a coat that isn't going to pick up brambles and isn't going to trap a dog. So you're seeing more wire haired coats in that. You'll see that in the terriers as well. Some of the
Mhm.
wire haired coats in that. If you're working on terrain that doesn't have a huge amount of thorns or bushy undergrowth, but maybe is a kind of a big flat kind of prairie type or moor type terrain, you might see more of the kind of your short coated dogs that need to be able to release heat quite quickly because they're doing
Mhm.
a lot of sprinting and running for a long period of time. You see Gus, your German wire-haired pointer, that has multiple roles within that versatile group, and so he needs that kind of. He's a very light wire-haired coat. The wire-haired, it's amazing. It doesn't. He'll go from being absolutely filthy one second to being perfectly clean the next. I don't know how it happens. He'll have a huge amount of things stuck in him, like little of those little sticky bobbins or whatever it is, and they'll just fall off with that wire-haired coat. But also, it's quite thin, so that he can release a lot of heat. An example of his abilities. But if I do a 10 kilometer or a 9 kilometer run in an area that luckily isn't near any sheep, any livestock, he actually does 30 within that time. I have a tracker on him now. It's quite interesting to see, and he could literally come home, have a little snooze, and do it all again half an hour later. There isn't really an end to his capabilities.
Yes. Yeah.
So
He's
they
always
do
on.
need always on. So they do need to,
Yeah.
well, always ready, put it like that. He can come home
Hmm.
and snooze for the rest of the day, or he could do it all again. So they're just bred to have this incredible fitness. So they do need to be able to release a lot of heat, obviously through panting, but also through their bodies. They don't need that thick coat. So they also need the long legs when you're working on long distances. You need that fit athletic type body, quite lightly built. Obviously, you're not going to see a Newfoundland galloping
No.
for 30 kilometers
The
after
St. Bernards
something.
are out. Yeah.
Exactly. And even a terrier, covering that amount of ground, or a small
Sure.
dog just isn't possible. So you really are seeing dogs developed in different areas of the world, pretty much for that terrain and for what you want
Hmm.
the dog to do. So even before all of the breeds diversified, you were starting to see, obviously, a smaller dog was more successful in flushing in hedges and
Hmm.
hedgerows, or maybe flushing rabbits out of burrows. So you're seeing that type of dog start to develop there, and obviously dogs that were good at their job were bred together. Dogs that weren't,
Yeah.
unfortunately, the reality is they were culled, in a lot
Yeah.
of cases. So you're starting to see the development in certain areas. So there's certain breeds that are named after certain areas in certain countries. It's incredible how it all diversified, I guess, and they started to become more classified. But it really was based on the terrain, on the job we wanted them to do, and that started to really appear very strongly when we started to get the emergence of the kennel clubs and starting to see breeds being named and specific,
Mm.
like in the show line, specific characteristics being given to each dog. And within the working lines, in the show lines, there's characteristics obviously that dogs need to fit into from an anatomical perspective, but very much in working lines, you see that as well. But there's lots of temperament tests, lots of kind of fitness tests, lots of functional tests as well. Is the dog actually able to, um, uh, for example, retrieve a duck without doing any harm to it?
Hmm.
Is it able to ignore a deer running by when it's been set on a duck? All of these things. So those are all the tests that we do as well in the working line, in this really high level group of breeders and people that are trying to generate a really high level dog for the task.
Mm, fascinating,
Mm.
fascinating. And what? So, if someone at home is sitting there and saying, "God, I'd love a challenge," and I've done kind of more family friendly breeds in the past, and now I'd love the idea of going out there with maybe even a show line gun dog. Are there any particular breeds that are good for beginners, or the ones that people might find particularly interesting? Beginners into gun dogs. Now I better specify.
What I would say to people is really just look at a dog that matches your personality. That's the biggest
Hmm.
thing. Again, I live with a dog that really is built for something completely different, but actually our personalities are quite similar. We both love the same terrain. I love running on the same terrain as he does. I love spending a little bit of time in water, so it's really looking at the type of dog you have and making sure that they match your personality, because if they don't, they're a lot of energy that doesn't match
Hmm.
yours, which is definitely a challenge. Your springers, probably in lots of cases, your springers and your cockers, you do see quite a bit. And the springers can be lovely, lovely, they're kind of very gentle temperaments in lots of ways when their needs are met. But you do need to have a whole heap of energy and absolutely love this energy that comes with them. Because if you don't, they're going to tire you out really, really quickly, because they're just going all the time. They're wondering where you're going next. They're just literally springing around all the time. So I would try to match the energy level of the dog. Again, in your setters and your pointers, yes, they have a huge heap of energy, but a big part of what we value in them is quite static pointing type behavior as well. So they can be a little bit easier maybe for first time owners, as long as you have a whole heap of energy. You're very aware that you're getting a dog that has been designed to need some off lead time, to need some running time, whether you're into canicross, whether you love hiking in the mountains. uh Having a dog that's going to walk beautifully next to you on a lead, you either want to be really interested in training, or be willing to meet their needs first, and then maybe go for
Hmm.
your walk in town afterwards. But also there are, of course, now lots and lots of field trials and kind of dog sports that have been developed for the working line dogs as well. But definitely it's something that it is not a cost effective sport to get into. There's quite a bit of travel, obviously, or outside certain areas, because it's more developed in other countries than in some countries more than others. But there's definitely little tasks you can do with dummies, and you can set up something kind of similar to a hunting situation. But again, you need to have quite a bit of spare time, good bit of creativity, and willing to do quite a bit of research, and to get involved with different kind of gun dog groups online if you really want to go down that line as well. But I probably would, for a beginner, I would say maybe start with the show line, because you're going to get a watered down version of that with a dog that does maybe enjoy having some off time as well. Um,
Yeah.
it does depend. There isn't probably any particular breed that's good for beginners, but more along kind of the springers, I guess. Some of the setters and some of the pointers. We're starting to see pointers as pets a bit more as well, and some beautiful Weimaraners. But again, whether they're working or show line, I'm not sure. I suspect quite a few of them that I see around here walking beautifully on leader, probably, probably a little bit more show line than your working line. But they're
Yeah.
they are they're fabulous, fabulous, fabulous group of dogs, and their talents are just endless. Really, it's amazing.
Yeah, it sounds absolutely fascinating, but you're definitely getting a lifestyle with it, regardless of whether
Yeah.
they're a show line or, I mean, generalizing here, but it's regardless of whether they're show line or working line, you're going to have a lot on your hands. It's not quite as much for urban living, and maybe you bring the dog with you down for a cappuccino to the local cafe and walk the 5 minutes back to your apartment. It's probably a different lifestyle.
You can wait 9 or 10 years and you'll absolutely have that for the last couple. It's great.
Yeah, exactly. After you've worked off all the calories through Canicross.
100%. But I had a lovely lovely clients recently actually that adapted a working line, a thoroughly working line Springer Spaniel from a rescue, and these clients would be definitely kind of in their 70s, should we say, but they beautiful, stunning dog, and they brought him home, and just again we had these loggerheads, but what they really wanted to do was to walk him on lead basically. But what we were able to find actually was the environment that they lived in. They did end up having to put up quite a bit of fencing, but they were able to meet his needs because they were able to, instead of feeding him out of a bowl, for example, we were able to do kind of creative scatter feeding. But again, it's not just a case of firing the food all over the back garden that you can get away beautifully with some dogs. It's very much setting it up to allow him to root into hedges, to allow him to, kind of creating little spaces that he had to kind of root into. But really this dog has become incredibly happy, and after those needs are met, he's very happy to potter down to the end of the road with them on lead and potter back up. So everybody's needs got met, and he was able to then embrace the downtime really, really nicely as well. But we did have to really look at turning all their expectations a little bit on their heads and finding out where their needs were going to be met, but also the dogs. And from there, we went. But it did involve a bit of a monetary outlay with some fencing and doing a little bit more driving to certain areas as well. So, but again, it can absolutely work. But it's no harm to reach out and just get a little bit, do your own research. But unfortunately, there's so much information online now, and it's so hard to kind of pick the wood from the trees, really. So it's no harm actually just reaching out to a certified professional who has an interest or who deals a little bit with that group of dogs, and just asking some questions. Even I'm always delighted to have a phone call with somebody and just giving a little bit of advice or talking things through, even without a consultation. Sometimes it can just be talking our way around things before they go and get that dog. But if they already have them in the home, we can always give advice. But again, even just doing a session can really change things around and help everybody to live in a bit more harmony. And sometimes it's not us giving you a huge heap more work. Sometimes it's just literally changing the lens that you're looking through and just rearranging some of the way that you spend your time with your dog, and it can be really rewarding then.
Definitely. And this is what I always say to people, you're getting a dog because you want to have a brilliant, enriched life with your dog. So why not spend that tiny bit extra time, money and effort into making it a really, really good relationship instead of a mediocre one that you're kind of battling against. So 100%. Definitely, sounds absolutely brilliant. And I love the fact that you hit on so many points during the conversation as well, of points where you were saying, that other dogs breeds mightn't be able to do this, the amount of stamina these breeds have, and the amount of drive and interest and all that. Thinking about back to my history with the St. Bernards and my Frenchie now, there's lots of of Canicross and Gundog events that they're probably not the best suited to, and these breeds could be brilliant for someone interested in getting into that. So thanks so much, Claire, for coming on and sharing everything that you know about gun dogs. It's been absolutely fascinating, as always. Thank you so much for coming on.
You're very, very welcome. And actually, could I one last little thing before we go? Because
absolutely.
Just when I was speaking there about the in COVID, we started to see a little bit more of the working lines coming into also the mixed breeds. So sometimes now when we hear maybe a cockapoo, we forget that the cocka part of that is actually a cocker spaniel. So it's just to make sure that you are asking the questions about working lines or show lines, and just trying, if the breeder doesn't know maybe the difference between that, if they don't know how to tell you whether it's a working line or a show line, maybe head somewhere else. But those are just important questions to ask, because there's springapoos and cockapoos and labradoodles, and again that Labrador these days could be your working line or your show line. So remember that those traits are potentially going to start to appear in your household, and it's not just this lovely little ball of fluff potentially. So just for people, I suppose, to ask a few more questions around that, and just to get a little bit more familiar with the show and the working line, and that the two different breeds, I guess, that are present in your mix. So those couple of little bits, I think then, at least if you go in with your eyes open, you can make some really good decisions from the start.
That's it. It's brilliant to be able to help people to set themselves up for success and their dog up for success. So that is
100%.
definitely brilliant advice. Thank you so much,
Thank
Claire.
you, Gillian.
Appreciate it. Once again, a huge thank you to Claire for joining us on the podcast this week and sharing such valuable information. If you'd like to check out more of what Claire and Snout and About get up to, feel free to check out our show notes where her social media and website are available. If you would like to check out more about what Ruby Reese gets up to, you can also find our social media, and our website is ruby-reese.com. Thank you very much for listening in. We have an episode coming out absolutely every single Tuesday, so please do subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts so that you get a reminder when the next one comes out next Tuesday. Thank you very much for listening in, and looking forward to seeing you then.